In 2020, the economics profession threw itself into analysing COVID-19 policies and their impact. So today I'm talking to Diane Coyle about her paper for COVID economics, which discusses whether this means economists will stop being policy villains and become heroes instead, and whether the crisis might actually change the nature of economics itself. Diane, welcome.
Hello.
Now, when this all blew up in March, one of the remarkable things in the economics profession is that so many economists dropped what they were doing and immediately plunged into COVID-19 research. Did this surprise you?
The scale of it surprised me, I have to say. And I think it's quite hard to overstate how strong that response was among economic researchers in the UK, where I'm based, but also around the whole world. I mean, obviously, there are lots of working papers, there are the CEPR covered economics issues, there are special issues of journals, there's the Economics Observatory website that we set up here to address questions that members of the public or policymakers would have. So it's a vast response. And certainly when you contrast that to the slower speed of the response to the great financial crisis in 2008 and 9 or to Brexit here, it's both the speed and the scale, I think, has been quite remarkable.
One of the things that you really notice over these thousands of papers is that it's not just economists feeding new data into their existing models. In many cases, they've taken on entirely new areas of research, haven't they?
Yes, some of the areas of research are kind of obvious because they're pressing policy needs. So macroeconomics, there has been a lot of work about the fiscal policy and monetary policy approaches to getting us through this and to recovery. So that's been an obvious area. But one where there's been a lot of new work done is the interaction between economics and epidemiology. And it seems to me this is absolutely essential if you are going to internalize all those trade-offs that we know policymakers struggling with in lots of countries. And I think this has come much more from the economist side than from the epidemiologist side. There are a few, including a colleague of mine, Flavio Toxved here, who did that work a long time ago. But there's now actually just a tide of work by economists integrating the epidemiology and the behavioural responses that we absolutely need to understand and get out of this situation. There have also been lots of more granular questions, and some of them there isn't much data to go on, but you can start thinking about how to approach it. And it's everything from impacts on particular sectors of the economy to job support schemes for freelancers who don't have formal employment relationships, or what's happening to supply chains. There are a lot of very specific questions that economists have been responding to the need for input.
In the paper, you compare the contribution of economists during COVID-19 to their contribution during World War II. What happened at that time?
Well, then there was a similar public service response by the economics profession. There were a lot of areas of policy that needed that input, whether it was wartime production and how to allocate resources to different production activities and ration consumption, thinking about financing the war, thinking about price controls, thinking about technological innovation. So all of those were key areas where economics input was invaluable. There were great differences too. At that time, the profession was much less formalised than it has become over the rest of the 20th century. There wasn't a formal government economic service in any of the nations, and that has changed now, obviously. So the economic research that we've been talking about is complementing research by official government economists. The main difference for me, though, is that in World War II, there was a period of real intellectual innovation in economics. And obviously, Keynes, the Keynesian revolution, was at the core of that. So his macroeconomic framework, the creation of the national accounts that were how that framework was put into practice. And then alongside that, the macroeconomic models of the kind that we've become familiar with now, but also optimization through operations research and game theory, also products of intellectual innovation in the Second World War. And that's the main difference that I would see now. So apart from the institutional aspect of the profession, we've got more professional economists. It's that the ideas that matched the crisis that they were being presented with at the time.
At this time round, have economists been as successful in embedding themselves in that way in policy debates and working in an interdisciplinary way as they were in World War II?
I think economists are now really very embedded in policy in a way that has changed quite a lot over the decades. And so a lot of individual economists have relationships with policymakers and talk to them frequently. And they've also been members of the formal government advisory groups that have been set up. So there is a very strong influence there by economists on policy. I do think it could have been more effective. And the thing that for me is really missing is this integration of all the different kinds of know-how that policymakers need to address the challenge that we're facing to get through the pandemic and then for the recovery afterwards. And this is partly about ideas, but it's also just partly about talking to people who are working in other disciplines. And whether that's the epidemiologists on the one hand, as I mentioned before, or the fact that if you want to invest in green recovery as part of the recovery strategy, then that's going to have to be alongside behavioural psychologists and engineers. And we need to have a much more holistic interdisciplinary approach to policy challenges. It's not only economists who are at fault in this. I think we're all stuck in our disciplinary silos. But there is something really useful in the way economics analyses problems that makes it, I think, not necessarily easier, but it should come naturally to economists to be able to attempt that interdisciplinary work and integration, because we are so good at top-down analytical frameworks due to the way that we've been trained.
There is one difference now, though, isn't there, Diane? Economists are in the doghouse after the global financial crisis. Often people talk about them as arrogant and aloof. Do you think that their contribution to COVID-19 can help them recover their reputation?
It's certainly true that there are a lot of people who continue to criticise economics as being very narrow, not paying attention to the real world. I think those critiques have become less and less fair. Not that we couldn't do a lot still to improve the profession. And in a way, it's the slowness of the response to the financial crisis, the fact that the curriculum took years to change, to acknowledge it, that helps explain both why those criticisms continue, but also why economists have reacted faster this time around. You don't want to make the same mistake of appearing to be completely remote from society twice, especially given the reputational impact that we know it had last time around. So I think the shock helps explain why it's been so much better this time. I mean, economics still has its issues. Some people argue that it's too mathematical, which I think is a bit misleading, because science is mathematical and that's just the way it is. And it's a way of handling statistics and so on. There is a kind of narrowness in some approaches to economics that doesn't appeal to me for sure, because I think this interdisciplinary approach is much more interesting and can contribute a lot more. And then above all, there's the lack of diversity in economics, whether it's gender or race or social class or whatever kind of diversity you want to think about. It has become a socially very narrow subject. And for social science, that becomes existential at some stage, because it changes the questions that people address. It changes the kind of evidence that they think is important in the methodologies. And so if we don't address that, we're going to become a much weaker and less influential subject over time. So there are all kinds of criticisms. I doubt we'll ever get away from critiques of economics, because it is a very influential subject in public policy and in people's lives. But I hope that we could tackle the right ones, not the wrong ones.
Do you think that perhaps there is also a new group of public economists coming through who are more engaged in public debate and in interdisciplinary debate that can help to make this happen?
There are very many wonderful economists now engaging in this public debate. Vox EU is a great example, but also using social media like Twitter, Econ Twitter, is fantastic. And this is warmly to be encouraged, I think, because when you do have a subject discipline that is so influential on people's lives, whose ideas have shaped the public philosophy that has governed our lives for a generation now, then you've got to have the legitimacy that comes in exposing your ideas and your work to the public. And I think that work of public communication is profoundly important.
One not so good impact of this switch to working at home lockdown, as you point out, is that the work of female economists has been affected more than their male peers. Is this a big loss? Is there a contribution that could have been made that now isn't being made?
Well, of course, because if you reduce the supply of people doing research, that's not good at a time like this. It's not just economics, it's been in loads of disciplines. I've seen comments about it from in the humanities and in the sciences too. And it is, of course, because the burden of informal care at home still tends to fall most on women. So one thing I hope that happens is that when universities are considering promotions in the next round, they make time allowances for that in the way that they do for maternity leave. Otherwise, we'll see the pipeline problem in terms of gender and economics get even worse. And of course, it does also affect what you might think it's interesting to research or what data you might think it worth gathering. A lot of the funding for research has gone into surveys and setting up questionnaires. And the kinds of questions that people even think to ask are determined by the experiences they have themselves. So you absolutely need that full range of diversity, including the input of women, to do good social science.
Well, we'll have to wait and see, because it looks like this is going to drag on for quite a long time yet. So we can hope that these contributions are maintained. But for now, Diane, thank you very much.
Thank you.
The paper we've been discussing is called From Villains to Heroes, the Economics Profession and its Response to the Pandemic, and that's in COVID Economics 48. Also by Diane, Economists Must Collaborate Courageously. That's in Nature 582, and that was published in May 2020. And Diane has written another book that's coming out next year. It's called Cogs and Monsters, Economics for the 21st Century, and that will be published by Princeton University Press. Well, keep looking out, as we were discussing, for all the fresh research on COVID-19 in COVID Economics. You can find that, as ever, free and open access at CEPR.org.